Welcome. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Daniel Schuker. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of International Economic Law here at Georgetown. Our institute is a place for ideas and impact. It's a place for cutting-edge research and open dialogue. It's dedicated to creating, refining, and building the ideas that will define the international economic order in the 21st century. That's been the animating force behind this institute since its founding 26 years ago. And that's what's really at the heart of this event. Now I'd like to give a quick overview of today's program. For our 8th annual Greenwald Lecture, we are pleased to welcome someone who has represented America's heartland in Congress, has served at the highest levels of government, and above all has a unique vantage point on the past, present, and future of US trade and the international economic order. And that is Senator Rob Portman. Our moderator will be Anna Swanson, who covers trade and international economics for the New York Times. She's been on the front lines and the front page, shining a light on the administration's trade actions, as she has done for many years from the US and China. She's been writing the first rough draft of history for this moment in the changing trade landscape. You'll hear more about both of them shortly from one of our faculty directors, Professor Greg Schaefer, who is a world expert on law and trade. But first, Tom Beeline is here today to speak about the legacy of this lecture's namesake, John Greenwald. Tom is a leading international trade lawyer. He is a partner at the law firm Cassidy Levy Kent, where he advises a wide range of clients on trade compliance, remedies, and other matters from steel to lumber to solar panels, from Brussels to Beijing. Tom has done it all. Tom's firm, Cassidy Levy Kent, generously endowed this lecture to honor the life of John Greenwald, who was a giant of the international trade bar. Tom is here to tell us more about that legacy and what it means for us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you to Georgetown University for hosting this event, and to Senator Portman and Anna Swanson for participating, and to my friends and colleagues here in attendance. My name is Tom Beeline. I'm a partner at Cassidy Levy Kent, where John Greenwald was one of the founding partners after a long and distinguished career in one of the country's most distinguished law firms. John's not a named partner because he said that adding his name to the door would sabotage the limerick he wrote in honor of the firm's founding. John's granddaughter, Imogen Greenwald Fraser, is also here today and is also a member of the Cassidy Levy team. I'm struck by the timing of this lecture. It's being given just days after the 10th anniversary of John's passing on September 1st. This lecture means so much to our firm and our colleagues here in DC, as well as our offices in Ottawa and Brussels, because it presents the opportunity year after year to celebrate, remember, and reflect on John's legacy as one of the titans of the US trade law and policy space. Indeed, he's one of the authors of the rules-based trading system we know today, and who was also intellectually honest enough to question the efficacy of those rules as they developed over the years. I've had the great pleasure to speak about John on a few occasions, both formally and informally. When I get the chance to prepare like I did today, I often reread John's writings from over his career for inspiration. John was an incredible person, both for his legal acumen as well as his humor. But what set him apart from others was his ability to convey complex ideas in simple, yet occasionally biting turns of phrases, used so well that you cannot help but agree or perhaps acquiesce to his point of view. And most frustratingly, not only would you agree, you'd actually find the thesis quite reasonable. I'd like to share a couple of passages of his writing with you to reflect on today. First, in 1987, he wrote a piece for the Stanford Journal of International Law, which I know is probably not politic to raise here, but he did it anyway. And he raised the following two issues in his writing. First, he wrote, quote, "The sooner we correct our trade deficit, the better. Either a sharp increase in exports or a sharp drop in imports, or a combination of the two, can restore order to the trade deficit. The most satisfactory approach would be to close the gap by increasing exports. However, for various reasons, the prospect of cure for the deficit through a sharp increase in US exports are remote. The apparent unwillingness of Japan and West Germany to institute policies to increase their imports and continuing import restraints of South Korea, Taiwan, Brazil, and a host of other countries make closing the gap difficult, if not impossible. Second, in that same writing, he focused on semiconductors, textiles, and steel as industries facing, quote, sectoral trade problems. And he proposed a series of dynamic and market reacting import restraints to stem the tide of import competition. For semiconductors, he noted, quote, government and private sector experts have properly concluded that a healthy US semiconductor industry is essential to the United States for both national and economic security reasons. For textiles, he explained that the US competitive advantage in producing fibers, yarns, and fabric was tantamount and paramount to everybody, and proposed tariff and quota-free imports of products produced with those US-made yarns and or fabrics. For steel, he proposed very high tariffs or import bans that would only be relaxed upon retirement of inefficient foreign steelmaking capacity. That was 1987. Fast forward to 2009, John wrote in an article for the Texas International Law Journal, quote, because the United States has already reduced most of its tariffs on manufactured goods to nuisance levels or less, because the United States does not permit business combinations that operate as effective non-tariff barriers to trade, and because the trade measures that the United States does use, such as the anti-dumping law, are already subject to strict WTO discipline, it has little leverage within the WTO system that can be used to persuade a country such as China, South Korea, India, or Brazil to agree to significant changes in their export incentives or import disincentives. The leverage needed to promote exchange rate adjustments and to open overseas markets that now limit the access of US goods and services must be created. That was 2009, on the heels of the great financial crisis. These were provocative thoughts at a time when conventional wisdom would not have countenanced the big idea. Free trade was the lodestar. But John relished the argument. He encouraged engagement. He enjoyed asking the provocative questions and did not shy away when the answers were also provocative. Was it all just legal theory and rhetoric? Absolutely not. John was pushing trade law further than it was ready because John knew that the trade laws applied in DC affect real people in real communities throughout the United States, whether domestic workers out of a job or businesses and workers that needed export markets to survive. He understood well that trade laws and policies needed to be continually challenged and modernized to ensure that they worked fairly and in the national interest. So John challenged the status quo. Would he agree with every step the United States was taking today? Heck no. He'd be asking the questions. He'd be challenging the premise and certainly the execution. He'd be provocative and he'd engage. And the greatest honor we have to give his memory is to do the same here today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Greg Schaefer to formally introduce Senator Portman and Anna Swanson. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for Cassidy Levy Kent for funding this and for our institute. And we hope that we do a really great job today in carrying on John Greenwald's legacy. And thank you for the warm words about John. I'd like now to introduce Senator Rob Portman and Anna Swanson. Let me start with Senator Portman. He has an incredible career in terms of the breadth of career in politics. He served under 3 presidential administrations, 2 terms in the US Senate, 6 terms in the US House of Representatives. In the George H.W. Bush administration, he served as associate counsel for the president and director of the White House Office of Legislative Affairs. Then, in the next Bush administration, he served as United States Trade Representative and Director of the Office of Management and Budget. And one of the things that I love, since my passion is also international trade, obviously teaching that here at Georgetown, is that Rob said that of all his jobs, his favorite job, and I read this, was being United States Trade Representative. Senator Portman is known for his civility, for his kindness, for his bipartisan lawmaking in Congress, for his grasp of a range of complex issues. And I'll just say, give a personal note to this. I should know because I went to high school with Rob Portman, and I also went to college with Rob Portman. And the reason why I followed Rob to college was that he hosted me for a weekend up at Dartmouth College during fall colors in New Hampshire. And you might say that that's not the best reason to choose a college, fall colors in New Hampshire. But anyway, Rob is very persuasive. After that, of course, Rob's career took another whole different trajectory. I could stop here, but I'd like to go on because I think it's remarkable in terms of the bipartisan legacy of policymaking of Rob. He altogether, he was the author of 220 bills that became law under 3 presidential administrations, under the Trump, Biden, and Obama administrations. And that's a remarkable record of actually creating law. He was the chief negotiator on the Republican side of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which has been responsible for roads, highways, ports, broadband, bridges, and more. He played a key role in U.S. foreign policy on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he was a co-founder and co-chair in the Senate for the Senate Ukraine caucus, obviously so important today. He built bridges in the halls of Congress, and he helped to build bridges across America. Not only did he build bridges between parties, because of his knowledge of the other parties' positions, his policy positions, and his persuasiveness, he played the roles of Obama and Gore in practicing for presidential debates for Bush 43, McCain, and Romney. Senator Portman currently serves as founder and co-chair of the Portman Center for Policy Solutions at the University of Cincinnati, and he's a distinguished visiting fellow in the practice of public policy here in Washington, D.C. at the American Enterprise Institute. He serves on the board of directors of Procter & Gamble, Bechtel Group, the National Parks Foundation, and the Atlantic Council here in Washington, D.C. He's an advisory member on the board of many other nonprofits. Let me turn to Anna Swanson. It's a great pleasure to introduce Anna. I mean, I feel like I already know you because I think I read you every day almost. Anna is a reporter for the New York Times on international trade, economic issues. She previously was reporter on the Washington Post, handling again issues of the economy, trade, the Federal Reserve. She's, of course, one of the best sources for understanding up to date what's happening in U.S. trade policy and the international economic legal order today. She's, before that, she worked in China for many years. She worked as a foreign policy South Asia channel, a news site focused on policy analysis of the region, and the editor-in-chief of China Economic Review. She's a regular contributor to America's Public Media Marketplace and has appeared on CNN, MSNBC, PBS NewsHour, and so much more. She earned her bachelor's degree in cultural anthropology from Northwestern and a master's degree here in Washington from Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. She was born and raised in a small town in Iowa. And she spent 8 years studying and living in China, learning Mandarin Chinese. So we are so grateful to both of you to join us here at Georgetown and our institute to have this important conversation on international trade and the international economic order. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Senator Rob Portman and Anna Swanson.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm delighted to be part of this program and really delighted, really honored to interview you as well, Senator. at such a fascinating and pivotal time for trade. We have a lot we can talk about.
There's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. So we can dive right in, and I'll start with an easy one. I wanted to ask your thoughts on what went wrong with globalization and how we ended up here. Is there a good reason, in your view, that Americans are feeling more skeptical of international trade? Is there anything to President Trump's arguments, his criticisms of global trade and the unfairness there?
Yeah, first of all, just quickly to thank Greg. Those comments were very nice. He did better than me in high school. He did better than me in college. So, and obviously better than me at the law business. So he followed in my footsteps, but passed them. And Tom, thank you. Nice words about John. Dan, thanks for your help today. Yeah, look, I mean, I think the American people as a whole have always been a little skeptical of trade, right? Because trade has a lot of benefits in a broad context, sort of broad and wide, but it also has negative impacts that are felt more acutely, usually in a community or business. And so the workers in Ohio, who I've represented in the House and the Senate, as you said, generally speaking, are skeptical. So you sort of start there because they figure they're not getting a fair shake, that it's not a level playing field. And in many cases, they're right. I mean, it depends on the industry. Ohio's big steel and auto state, as you know, those are both strategic industries. And over time, you know, we brought a lot of trade cases to try to help protect some of those jobs for good reason, because other countries were subsidizing or dumping, selling at low cost, or not protecting our IP and other things. So, yeah, I think it's, generally speaking, you have to make the argument for trade and make it effectively if you're going to overcome that skepticism. So it doesn't surprise me. Mm-hmm. I think one of the differences in this administration is that President Trump campaigned on this first time and second time, and you know, seemed very interested in balancing something that not everybody focuses on, which is kind of the macroeconomic balancing, the trade deficit with specific countries, and then the broader trade deficits that increased actually in the first Trump administration, but continue to be something that he has a lot of concern about. Economists differ on that as to whether a trade deficit hurts the economy or not. But he's been consistent on that. And so when you look at what's happened, and we'll talk about IEPA in a minute, how he did this, but what he's doing now is looking around the world. You remember the chart that was up there that said, you know, oh my gosh, 16 to 18% is probably the average tariff that was being levied against the United States. And we were probably at 3 or 4%. How is that fair? And people see that and think, yeah, how is that fair? Why shouldn't there be a level playing field? Why shouldn't there be more balance in trade? So to answer your question, it doesn't surprise me that this has become a bigger issue. What does surprise me a little bit is to watch the parties on this, because typically, you know, Republicans, when I was in the House and the Senate, were more on the free trade side, and Democrats more on the protectionist side, or at least maybe not all the way protectionist, but thinking we ought to have higher barriers in place. And now when President Trump, you know, comes out with his proposals, one would have thought maybe there'll be some meeting in the middle here, right? But it's almost like everything's so partisan now in Washington that first they're partisan with Republicans on one side, Democrats, and now they switch places, but really didn't meet in the middle. So it's an interesting phenomenon. And I think there is a middle ground here. I really do. And I think balanced trade is what people want. I think you can do it while still enjoying the benefits of trade. We can maybe talk more about that later.
Yeah. You mentioned the benefits of trade. You mentioned something about explaining the benefits of trade to people. So you think that still is an important mission as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you have such an interesting career. It's touched on a little bit in the introduction, but you were the USTR under George H.W. Bush in the 2000s, when free trade was almost a religion, people say, right? You were saying in the green room that you worked as a petitioner representing fishermen against Canadian trade cases.
Just for a second on that, because it has a Georgetown connection. Jennifer Hillman, who couldn't be here today because she's overseas at a trade meeting, was the one who asked me to come and promised me she'd be here. So, but Jennifer's a very good friend of mine. And we started off together in Washington in 1984, practicing trade law, straight out of law school. And we were at the firm called Patton, Boggs and Blow at the time. Some of you know Frank Samolis, who was our boss. And we took cases. In my case, I was the lowly associate, the one doing all the grunt work on a fisheries case. Who can forget the Northeast ground fisherman case, right? Cod, cod, okay.
It's a classic one. You'll have to look it up.
And so it was the Canadians versus the United States, and like sort of cut my teeth on countervailing duties. And then years later, then I went home to Ohio, and of course I tried to practice trade law unsuccessfully because there was no clients. So I had to become a business lawyer. But I've always loved it. And then later, when George Bush asked me to leave the House and come to USTR, I was delighted to do so. And it was, Greg mentioned my favorite job in the sense that you get to represent our great country. And I think we've done a great service to the world in terms of encouraging reform, not just on the trade front, but on the economic front generally. And I'm a big fan of trade agreements for that reason, talking about the traditional FTAs, because it puts the United States in a position not just to lower barriers on both sides. And by the way, about half of our exports go to 10% of the world, which is where we have a trade agreement. So it's good for exporters. But also it requires those countries to look at things like the environment, human rights, labor policy, and general efficiency of their economy and make changes. And it's been a benefit. So that was a fun job in that sense.
Mm-hmm. When you look back on that career, your time as USTR, as a lawyer, as a representative, do you see any, seeds now of, where the path for trade might have been kind of going wrong and this growing disillusionment, where things might have gotten off track when you look back at that?
Well, there's some experts in the room on the WTO, but I will say, from my point of view, try to be humble here in terms of how all of us looked at trade at the time. I think we thought the WTO could be more effective. And I wonder why we thought that, because, there is no WTO army, much less an enforcement mechanism of some kind. And, honestly, when China came into the WTO, I think people thought, great, they're in the rules-based system, they're going to have to follow the rules. And they didn't. And what was the consequence? I think we were distracted as a country then on other things, partly, and partly we were just happy to had the opportunity to liberalize things in China. And, there was a movement in China then, this is back in 2000, 2001, to actually liberalize the economy. And I think that's what really caused the big increase in exports. It wasn't the WTO membership, since China had MFN access to the US market dating back to the Nixon administration. And so people sometimes criticize me for my vote on PNTR. I think it was the right thing to do. I don't think it was the right thing to do to ignore, to your question, the shortcomings of the WTO, and to take steps, therefore, both in terms of our trade laws being enforced, more assertively and aggressively, but also in terms of workers who are disproportionately impacted through trade adjustment assistance or other means. We kind of let it go, right? And so there was this huge increase in exports. China's market exploded. The Deng Xiaoping's reforms worked. By the way, the heavy hand of governments coming back now with regard to President Xi, and that's going to hurt China more. In the meantime, they're doing just fine in terms of exports. Not to anticipate your next question about globalization, I think you're probably going to ask, but people say, is globalization dead? And I paraphrase Mark Twain, reports of my death are greatly exaggerated. China had record exports again last year, and this year will again, I think, at the end of the day. It's down a little bit this year compared to what it normally would be. But I think China will once again have a record year in terms of exports. And by the way, the global trading system continues to be strong. Last year, we had probably a 4% increase in trade, driven primarily by services, but also even in goods. There was over 2% growth in trade. So trade is not dead, and it's very active, and globalization will continue. I do think that countries like the United States and others are pulling back, and the exports to the United States are relatively lower from China, as an example. And you'll see more of that as well, more of a sort of a country-first approach and more of a populist approach in many countries. But it's not like trade isn't still a significant part of the global economy.
Mm-hmm. I definitely want to ask you more about that. First, I want to ask you about the legal battles that are unfolding right now with the Trump administration and the president's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act really being questioned in the courts, which could undermine a lot of the tariffs that the president has issued on Liberation Day, the fentanyl tariffs against Canada, Mexico, and China. How do you evaluate the legal arguments in those cases? And what is your view personally?
Yeah. Greg, could you answer that question? So, I mean, I think it's going to be interesting to see what the court does. I mean, who knows? This is a case they've just taken up. They're doing it under expedited proceedings, as you know. The expedited basis of it means that probably we'll know in December, maybe early January, probably December. So it's coming up pretty quickly. And there's often quite a bit of deference to the executive branch in terms of international policy, particularly with regard to emergencies. So my look at it is that although IEPA does not mention tariffs, it's been used before with regard to trade sanctions, not tariffs. I would be surprised if the court doesn't say that the emergency powers there would permit tariffs, but the tariffs would have to be based on an emergency. I mean, if everything's an emergency, nothing is an emergency, right? And so I think IEPA, when you look at the history of the law, is probably more about emergencies than it is about what tool one president or another might use. And this president has chosen to use tariffs. I think that will be upheld. You mentioned fentanyl. I mean, that could be a case where if he has made the argument based on fentanyl and has tariffs based on fentanyl, that could be a national emergency. We have over 100,000 Americans dying every year, fentanyl overdose. So I think that's not an unlikely outcome. Of course, that means that all of the other tariffs, just about, or a lot of the other tariffs would probably not qualify under IEPA. If there are reciprocal tariffs that are in place because we have a trade deficit with another country, that's probably been in place for decades, those deficits, that is, and probably not an emergency. So former President Bolsonaro's treatment in Brazil is probably not an emergency in terms of how you would treat Brazil with tariffs. So I do think it could result in some significant disruption if I'm right. I could be totally wrong, and it could be that the court will use this as an opportunity to continue their principle that this is a major questions doctrine, and that it cannot be used. Or they could say, again, in deference to a presidential authority generally in foreign policy and with regard to emergencies, maybe they'll say it's all appropriate. But if they did this divining where they say, is it an emergency or not an emergency, that will be very interesting. And I talked briefly about this on our pre-call, but I do think people forget sometimes that there are at least 4 other avenues. One we know well, 232, because it was used extensively in the first administration, and there are actually 10 232 cases right now, as you know, not just steel and aluminum and semiconductors, but pharmaceuticals and others. So those would be available. And 301, of course, would be available, which was used extensively in the first administration, particularly as it relates to China. In fact, those tariffs are still there from China. And both of those require a report, but that report can be done pretty quickly. And in some of these cases, they feel strongly there's an imbalance, so they would use it appropriately there. Then there's 122, which is somewhat limiting because, as I understand it, it's limited to 150 days, 15%. But that's, you really don't have to prove anything and no report. That's internal. And then there's 338 that maybe Greg knows about, but nobody else in the room had probably heard of, including me, until a few months ago. But this is a 1930s law that could be employed in this way. I think it was originally put in place, from what I understand about the history, to enforce MFN treatment with other countries. And when those countries had discriminated against the United States, the president was able to issue a report, all internal. Again, no difficulty in the president doing that. So he could use some of these other authorities to pick up some of the other issues. And I'm sure they're looking at those and probably have some ideas as to which, if an emergency is not considered by the court, it's not considered to be an emergency, that there's another way to get at it.
I noticed among your options, you did not list Congress or legislative tariffs. Why is that? So what do you think the role of Congress should be? And, if I can just pry a little bit, I'm curious if you've have you had any conversations with other Republican lawmakers? What are their attitudes towards what's going on right now, or what they think the role of Congress should be?
You sound like a reporter now. Oh, you're a reporter. Okay.
Shift into reporter mode.
Not you're a cultural anthropologist. Yeah, I don't know. I worked on 232 legislation when I was in Congress in my last few years, and I thought that 232 had gotten kind of out of hand, and we had to pull it back a little bit, and we couldn't get agreement between Democrats and Republicans, even among Republicans, and it was frustrating. And so I thought that was a pretty easy one for Congress to step in and say, wait a minute, this is how 232 ought to work. It ought to be an actual national security issue, and that the Secretary of Defense ought to be the one to determine that, not the Secretary of Commerce. Simple things like that, which would have curtailed 232's use, I think, to more of what the drafters intended. Couldn't even get that done. So I'm a little skeptical on Congress these days, the dysfunction in Congress on everything, pretty much. I may be proven wrong soon on the government shutdown. Maybe they'll get their act together and do that, which would be great. But I'm just not sure Congress wants to jump in. And it may be partly because of what I talked about earlier, the shifting view of Democrats and Republicans. Now you have Democrats, not all of them, taking a more, I guess, not free trade, but pro-trade point of view, and Republicans taking more of a pro-Trump, more of a protectionist point of view. So it's complicated, isn't it? And I'm not sure, with the current Congress, they've got their hands full with other issues and they're not solving them. So it's tough to imagine Congress stepping in. It would be great if Congress were to take this on. And there's some very good members up there who I think are sort of balanced trade advocates, and come up with kind of a new formulation, like, what should we be doing? I don't object to President Trump leveraging the power of our market, for instance. And when you use that power, you can negotiate some pretty good bilateral agreements, as we've seen. I mean, the only country that's retaliated is China. Now, that may change, but because people really do want access to our market. And the WTO is not effective right now. So I think that's sort of a new way to think about things. I'm not suggesting that everything that has been done is a good idea. In fact, my view would be, by using the power of our market, you could get, as we have with, again, 10% of the world where we have free trade agreements, you could get to 0. And if that were to happen, I think a lot of people in this room and others would be very pleased, I think. And so I think that would be interesting if Congress were to take that up and to say, let's put together kind of a new rubric here of how to approach trade, which would lead to, yes, using the leverage of our market, which is substantial, but with the intent of lowering barriers on both sides. They wouldn't necessarily need to be called formal FTAs. I think those are kind of cumbersome these days and tough to get done. The Biden administration did 0 and did 0 negotiating on FTAs, which frustrated me. But I get it. They're complicated. They're hard. But these trade agreements that are less comprehensive, I think, are very possible. And the idea, again, should be to reduce barriers and using the market to do that. And I think there would be a new sort of TPA formulation there that would be easier to get through Congress. So anyway, those are some thoughts that you could see going forward if Congress takes this on.
I did want to ask you about the Trump administration's use of the American economy kind of as such a powerful source of leverage, like a hammer almost, right, to drive negotiations. And it sounds like you think that is, effective. I wonder if you see, other downsides to that. Often people talk about the world kind of moving on without the United States, or, that there might be other consequences to that kind of approach.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think it's been pretty effective. You could look at it in different ways, I suppose. But, we have an agreement with the EU. We have an agreement with Japan. We have an agreement with Korea. We have, agreement with the UK. We're hopefully going to get something together with China, not just TikTok, but trade related. The other thing that I think we've done is we've taken non-trade issues in, that really don't belong in a trade context. But, I mean, China is being very active, as we saw with the recent meetings, with Vladimir Putin and North Korean President Kim Jong-un, and they want to have different approach to the rules-based order, but still the United States and our market is sought after. And I think people, value the partnership. We've got to be sure that, we don't push countries away. But I don't see it happening yet. In fact, I mentioned earlier, not a single country has retaliated, which surprised me, honestly. Mm-hmm. But I think a lot of it is because they do want to be working with us, with our market. Also, I think there's some national security implications here, as was noted earlier. It was you, Tom, or Greg, or who was it? That for the EU, they did, as I understand it, they did compile a list of potential items to be retaliated against and chose not to go there. And that may have been partly because of national security concerns that they want to have the United States right now very tight with them as it relates to Russia and Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard that security considerations were very important for the EU, for Japan, for Korea. Obviously, mm-hmm. The security relationship is kind of top of mind, right? Mm-hmm. So, what role do you think the WTO should play then, if any? Do you think the WTO is kind of dead? The U.S. is in arrears now with its payments to the WTO. What do you think about that situation?
Well, I said earlier it's been ineffective, and you can point fingers at different parties, including the United States, I suppose, as to why. But in terms of dispute settlement, I just don't think they're respected, and so that's not a very effective way to go. In terms of trade negotiations, I spent a lot of time on Doha thinking we were almost there. Here we are, like 15 years later, and not even close. So that's frustrating too. I've thought for some time, and it's not a major revelation, that the WTO has to get away from consensus if they're to be successful. And the reason is countries, including China, frankly, and other countries, India, Brazil, and others, have used the WTO to avoid making tough decisions, particularly non-market economies like China. And there has to be a better way. I like plurilateral agreements because I think that enables like-minded countries to come together and to continue to enforce rules that, among themselves would lead to better standards or better trade. I think of the government procurement agreement as an example of that. So that's what I would do. I mean, it's tough when you have a consensus organization to get away from consensus, right? So you might have to almost recreate something that has a plurilateral context. And plurilateral, for those of you who don't know what that means, because 99% of Americans don't or shouldn't, but it just means that instead of having all the countries in WTO agree to something, you just have those countries that of like mind and don't let other people hitchhike on it. And I think you can make real progress right away on environmental goods, as an example. You could on services, I believe. And, there may be 4 or 5 countries that are left out that are major economies, but if they don't want to live by those standards, I think you move ahead. And that would be, to me, a much more effective WTO.
Mm-hmm. We saw a kind of an interesting and ominous demonstration of the Chinese control over the global supply chain this year with rare earth magnets and minerals, and how they responded to U.S. tariffs. And they were really the exception when it comes to retaliation, right?
Absolutely.
I wonder what you think should be done about Chinese dominance of these supply chains. Do you think tariffs are sufficient when it comes to that? What is your view on industrial policy, the role for that?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, we need to look at our own house, which is something that, I hope all of us agree with, and we've talked about this, many of us, over time, is that, we look to other countries to change their behavior. And, there are rare earth materials, minerals, and they're not being exploited here. And so when we become so dependent on China for something that is so crucial for our economy, it's so strategic, it's our own failing. Second, there are other countries that are very friendly countries, and friend sourcing is something we have to be doing. Canada is one. Canada has a lot of rare earth minerals and magnets, and they're willing to work with us, or they were. Let's work with Canada. And, we've worked with Australia already. We have an agreement with Australia, as I understand it, on some of their rare earth, including going back into some of the mines that were abandoned, where there's still material. So we've got to sort of clean up our own house first. But second, you're right. Right now, China is not just the source of it, but it's where these rare earth materials are processed. So we've got to build up our own processing facilities here in this country at least for our own rare earth minerals, and encourage other countries that are allies to do the same. And in the meantime, it gives China great leverage. And if you look at these trade negotiations with China, I believe that was their number one point of leverage. We had several. We had 2 or 3 things that we could talk about, which were important, but none rising to the level of General Motors and Ford and other companies saying, if we don't have these rare earth minerals pretty quickly, we're going to have a lot of cars in the parking lot that we can't move forward on. So anyway, it's a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you think tariffs help U.S. manufacturers, though, or are there instances too? I mean, American steel is now, great for steelmakers, but among the most expensive in the world, which is painful for car makers and for companies making other things, right? So, do you think tariffs help manufacturing?
Well, it's a fair question. And again, representing Ohio, we have a lot more people that work with steel, bend steel, make things out of steel, including car manufacturers, than we do steel makers. On the other hand, we have to be able to make steel in this country, I believe. I don't think that's something that we should be dependent on China or anybody else for. And, with the possible exception, again, it was friendshoring on the north and south borders, which we should have, better relationships with from a North America point of view. But, it's true that ultimately we as consumers are paying more because these people that work with steel, make things out of steel, are paying more. On the other hand, we don't want to see a situation where we're not able to make the steel we need, certainly for our national defense and even for other strategic industries. So I think it's a balance. You don't want to go too far, but you got to be sure that you're going far enough to keep the steel industry here in this country. And I speak to you as an Ohioan with a lot of steel. So maybe I'm a little biased on steel, but I think there's a way to do both. I mean, with technology, particularly AI, being used in everything, including steel production, we're going to become more efficient, and we'll be able to do more. Cleveland-Cliffs is in Ohio, probably the biggest steel company in America now, and they're doing quite well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, where do you see trade policy evolving in the next 5 to 10 years? I know that's a really, difficult question, but I'd love to see, you talked earlier about the sort of political realignment on trade.
Yeah.
Do you think that will stick? Do you think we could see some kind of political backlash to what is going on right now? If you're going to look into your crystal ball.
Yeah. It's a time of uncertainty, isn't it? And by the way, everything we talked about here in terms of tariffs and trade and so on, when I talk to members of Congress about what the future might be or what they might want to do, their response is often, let's wait and see. Let's wait and see. When I talk to the business community, what should we do? What's your position on these tariffs and your impact on your business and so on? Let's wait and see. And the notion is letting things settle out because there's so much confusion right now and uncertainty. And it's particularly difficult when tariffs go up and then go down, up and down. But I think in a way that's very commonsensical to say, let's let it settle out. Let's see where it ends up and then see what the impact's going to be politically, legislatively, and in terms of our economy. Look, I think we are in a new era where people are better informed and people want to be sure that they're getting a fair shake. And I mentioned earlier the nation first approach. I think it's not just going to be in the United States. I think it's going to be elsewhere. I look at these governments in the EU and the political parties that are on the rise in the UK and France, Germany, Poland, Netherlands. They're more populist parties. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the direction we're going as a global community, not just in Europe, but in the United States and elsewhere. So I do think, the notion of unfettered free trade is no longer going to be acceptable. And it'll be sort of case by case, what is strategic, what is not. My concern is more that, Congress at this point, as we talked earlier, does not have the interest or ability maybe to come together with a policy about that. What is really strategic and how do you deal with that? versus other products. There are probably some products that fall in between, like electronics, but between toys and semiconductors, there's a big change, right? And we should have a separate policy for both of those. Mm-hmm. And we should be encouraging trade between countries because comparative advantage is real. You will see lower costs for consumers, but also protect American jobs and protect American national security. And that I mentioned earlier, that I think there's a great middle there where we need to see Congress fill that gap. I don't know if it'll happen soon, but I think at some point it will. So I don't see a big backlash because I think people generally, again, are skeptical unless you take the time to explain otherwise. Mm-hmm. But I do think that there's an opportunity to find that great middle, what I call balanced trade, where you have trade and healthy levels of trade. As I noted earlier, trade is healthy right now in the sense of there's more trade going back and forth in 2024, the last year we have numbers for, than the previous year. We continue to increase trade, particularly in China, massive exports again last year. This year maybe a little more curtailed, but also an increase. And so trade is not dead; it's out there. And we need to be sure that, from the United States point of view, that we continue to encourage trade, but do it in a way that's in the benefit of our economy and our national security.
Mm-hmm. I've often observed that too. So, people talk about the deglobalization, the reverse of globalization, but actually you have, ships getting bigger, you have, more and more people around the world entering the middle class and buying things. You have the spread of the internet, of AI, which increases trade facilitation, right? So a lot of forces that are just powering interconnectedness, right? Even as people get more skeptical. So you think the demise of globalization is
exaggerated.
Is exaggerated.
So it's interesting you mentioned that because some of the increased trade, and again, there's some experts in the room here, is in Southeast Asia, and it's among countries that we consider developing countries, and so it's it's Vietnam and it's Indonesia and it's the Philippines and so on, and they're on the move. China's doing a lot of agreements, as you know. There aren't comprehensive agreements like ours, so there's movement there. South America, there's depending on the country, there's significant trade increases. So in the developing world, you're right, that's happening.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'll open it up to audience questions in just a minute. I guess one thing I would ask is, trade is obviously the center of kind of both of our lives, but I wonder if do you feel that, sometimes it can kind of become a scapegoat, or that the impact is exaggerated politically? Or do you think that trade policy has the power to kind of fix all of these things in the United States that politicians are talking about?
Yeah, I mean, the reality in the United States is that technology plays a bigger role than trade in terms of our challenges to manufacturing jobs. So we're producing a lot, our output is good, but we have fewer and fewer jobs. And people often blame trade for that. And there is something to it, particularly with regard to some of these strategic industries like steel. When China produces a glut of steel every year with the idea of cornering the market and making us uncompetitive, I mean, that's something you got to pay attention to. And it's heavily subsidized. And as I said, I kind of grew up in that, as a trade lawyer, looking at some issues like that for countervailing duties and anti-dumping. So there is that's happening. But by the same token, when you really look at the economics of it, our jobs are being reduced more by technology, prior to AI even coming. And now with AI, it's even more the case. I recently saw an interesting video this week of a manufacturing plant. It's actually in Europe, not in the United States, but it's coming to you soon. It's manufacturing product without a single individual. Somebody is managing the plant. The lights are off. It's the fourth shift. So you have 3 shifts, and then that 2 a.m. shift that nobody wants to work anyway, totally automated. And, the consistency, the quality, the safety is all good. And that's what's coming. So we have to realize that, you can blame trade, but this is a reality, maybe in addition to trade, that is affecting every industry, in manufacturing in particular. For those of you who are involved in agriculture, when you go, to some of these big farms in the Midwest, like in Ohio, and believe it or not, I'm a farmer myself. Just a little dirt under my fingernails here somewhere.
I can see it.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing. One farmer on a very large combine, handling 3,000 or 4,000 acres. I mean, it's just there are fewer people needed with technology, and GPS is determining every turn of that tractor, and it's very efficient.
And you can sit and watch Netflix in the cab of your tractor, actually.
Yeah. Mine's not air conditioned. Yeah, I got to work on that.
Yeah. All right, great. I'd love to take some audience questions for the senator.
Questions, comments, thoughts?
You over here, Austin? And we'll bring a microphone to you. And please state your name and your affiliation first. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Sandra Soon, and I head the economic section at the Singapore Embassy. Thank you very much, Senator Portman, for your remarks this afternoon. I have a question about the longer term. There's been a lot of short-term volatility in trade policy, which you alluded to in your remarks. But I was curious to hear whether you thought there were any long-term trends emerging, particularly those which international partners should be alive to and could construct a positive dialogue with the US around. So one long-term trend would be, tariffs, I think, will be here to stay even after this administration. 15, maybe the new 0. Industrial policy looks like a potential other long-term trend, but there are other new developments like the US government taking stakes in companies like Intel. And I was curious to hear whether you think there are long-term trends developing in areas like this, and if so, how can international partners engage the US in a positive economic dialogue? Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. There is no country in the world that is a better example of the benefits of trade affecting all citizens than Singapore. Some would have said Hong Kong at one point, and that was true, I think. But having been to Singapore to speak at a conference maybe a year and a half ago, it's extraordinary. And Singapore's, we have a trade agreement. It's always at the top of the list saying, well, should we do, a Trans-Pacific agreement with our partners? Singapore's always at the top of the list. So I hope that's a trend. I mean, I hope that, with our allies like Singapore, that we need to talk about how to counter China in the region by having closer trade relationships. And I hope 15 is not the new 0 in that case. That you actually could come together with a serious multilateral trade agreement to reduce barriers. In terms of industrial policy, I think you make a good point. I mean, it's not just the United States, but I think other countries too are looking at how to ensure that at least the strategic businesses, sectors of the economy are strong enough. In the United States, the extraordinary decision to invest directly in Intel, which you mentioned, I think is an outlier. I don't think that's going to happen in many cases. I think that was, when you look at what happened there, I know a lot about Intel because there's a big plant in Ohio that is not yet completed, but it was a $20 billion investment. And unfortunately, it's gone very slow because of Intel's challenges. But that was instead of a grant. So the U.S. government saying, under the CHIPS Act, which I supported, because I think having a semiconductor industry in this country is very important. And we were down to, about 12% of the chips being produced here and none of the high-end chips. Now we're maybe at 15%, not much better. But it's important that we have a viable U.S. semiconductor industry for national security reasons, for F-150s and F-35s. We just have to have it. So I think that was an unusual step. I don't see that being replicated. But it was instead of, what the legislation had called for, which would have been a grant to Intel. As I understand it, that was a sort of a one-for-one substitution. But I do think on the on the positive side, in terms of trade in Southeast Asia, that's an opportunity still waiting for us. We have free trade agreements with pretty much all the countries in the region that would comprise, a broader agreement, with the exception of Japan, where we have a framework now. And, one could argue we're maybe a third of the way toward a free trade agreement. But it wouldn't be a stretch to say, with regard to Australia, with regard to Singapore, with regard to other countries in the region where we have an agreement, that we should be able to come together and have a multilateral agreement. Japan, again, being the largest economy that's not currently with an FTA.
Okay, great. Let's take one more.
Hello, my name is Ruin, and I'm a student here at Georgetown Law. Given that I'll be trying out for the WTO moot court later on Friday, I wanted to ask what you thought of President Biden's decision to not appoint any new justices, continuing the first Trump administration's decision to leave the appellate body incapable of rendering any decisions. That, as you know, China has been gaining that hitchhiker effect where they've been able to benefit from the WTO while not necessarily following all of its rules. But with no ability at the appellate body, even countries, a set of countries that are following the rules are not able to get their issues handled anymore. Do you think that it was appropriate that the WTO framework as a whole didn't work? Or do you think there should have been justices appointed, that the US should have taken its retaliation with China as a separate matter?
Yeah, it's a good question, Ruin. You're going to be trained to become a member of the appellate body, so I sort of hope it opens up for you. You're going to be ready. Yeah, I mean, I said earlier, I think the very structure of WTO is flawed, and I think those judges who made decisions that the United States disagreed with, and specifically, I think didn't follow the rules with regard to non-market economies and China in particular. I just think that made it very difficult for the Biden administration, Trump administration before them to move forward. So, yeah, I think it'd be good if there were a appellate body that worked effectively to resolve trade disputes. I just don't have much faith in the current structure. I think the executive director is actually interested in looking at new ideas because she realizes that, it's not an effective body right now. And again, I think the plurilateral step would be the big step change. You'd really have a vibrant opportunity there, at least to promote not trade disputes, but trade agreements. And that might get the WTO back on track.
All right, maybe we take one more and then we'll wrap it up. Sure.
Good afternoon, Senator and Anna. Thank you for a very thoughtful conversation this afternoon. My name is Les Myers. I'm a proud Cincinnatian by birth.
Yes.
Although I've spent most of my life here in DC, I'm a triple Hoya. And my current role is working for a think tank called the Washington Institute for Business Government and Society with the former Assistant Secretary of Commerce, Jim Moore, from the Reagan administration. So we're very interested in these topics. I was very interested in the question that Anna asked a little while ago about the role of Congress. And I was surprised at the direction the conversation went, as though it were a discretionary question about whether Congress would get involved. And there has been a whole host of issues with regard to congressional oversight and respecting the three branches, et cetera, and the equality of them. And I was thinking of it more from a perspective of an Article I power of, I've always understood a tariff as a tax. And I was happy at the question and intrigued by the response, but I was just thought there'd be a little bit more because I wasn't thinking it was a matter of discretion, whether Congress would be involved, but that it has a duty to do so. Now, whether it's going to rise to that duty, that's a separate issue. But I was just curious if you could kind of maybe continue that thought a little bit more on what your thoughts are. But Thank you very much for the conversation.
Well, thanks, Len. By the way, the Reds still have a chance to get in the playoffs, so don't give up. Yeah, I mean, I was a little negative. Sorry about that. But I see the dysfunction. It troubles me, not just in this area, by the way, but broadly speaking. I think our country's number one issue on our democracy is the fact that we can't find common ground anymore. And that there's less incentive to do that, particularly the way the redistricting works and primary systems work and so on. So that's my broader rubric here that I worry. But you're right. Congress has responsibilities under Article 1 for tariffs and taxes, spending. And I think, most members of Congress are also happy to sit back and delegate those powers. And I went through all the delegation earlier. I mean, every one of those alternatives is a delegation of congressional power. And IEPA is, but certainly Section 232 and 301 are. 122 is not used that much, 338 not used that much, but these are decisions Congress made some years ago, like 338, but some more recently that we're just going to let the executive branch handle this. And I don't agree with that. On the 232 reform I tried to get through, just pulled back a little bit on that to say, hey, it's got to be an actual national economic or national security issue. But I think that's where Congress is these days. But I don't disagree with you that it's very clear that Congress has the ability to do it, but they have chosen over the years to delegate that authority. And maybe, to Anna's question, kind of suggesting what she was getting at, maybe there will be a response to this. Maybe there will be in a new administration, regardless who it is, a congressional reassertion of that responsibility and duty, depending on what the economy does, depending on what happens with this court case. I could also see it going the other way, though.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, if the Supreme Court chooses to say that IEPA cannot be appropriately used for all these matters, Congress may say, well, let's list tariffs specifically. Because I just don't think Congress is eager to get in the fray. I don't agree with that, but I'm just trying to give you my opinion. Thanks, Les.
I think we're out of time today, but thank you so much for a fascinating conversation.
Thanks, Anna.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Thank you all.